Chapter 4, the Tapestry, Ancestors, and Indisputable Fact of Life.
Love it.
It was in the late 1950s that our English trip took Fran and me to the north of Ireland. For so very long, I had heard my father talk about County Down in the town of St. Field, where his mother's people had come from. Now at last I was going to be in the location of some of my ancestors. As Fran and I peered together from the window of the plane, we saw what seemed to be waves of sand rising and falling, streaming out over a green beach. The colors seemed all wrong. No green-blue waves with white froth against a sandy beach, rather with a strange pulsating movement as though sucked by a strong undertow. Sand-colored waves were pulling back in great curves to reveal a green beach. As the plane swooped down to skim the runway and land at Belfast Airport, we saw that the waves of sand were wild, beige-colored jackrabbits. Did you expect that, Collie? Scurrying away in fear from the noise and wind of the landing plane, clustered so closely together in their mass exodus that the bright Irish green grass was seen in bare curves as the waves of rabbits receded into the safety of distance. And what was happening 100 years before that, and 100 years before that, and 100 years before that, as we pulled out bits of paper with penciled lines and tiny printed names spraying out from the lines, we are likely to feel we have all multiplied like rabbits and are equally as hard to trace back into the fields or woods. What is the difference? Well, we may have brown eyes, be small-boned and given to not growing very tall, or we may be Viking-like, blue-eyed blondes, swinging through our lives with 7-league boots. But we are not rabbits, nor peas in a pod, and there has been a lot more to our genes than the brown or blue eyes, the red, brown, black, or blonde hair. We are human beings, and being human is something we need to spend time and attention on, since a lot of people are making it their life work to try to teach us to be inhuman, especially about other human beings, and to treat them like rabbits or peas in a pod. Continuity is a part of who I am and who you are. Recognizing something of what our ancestors had to suffer, as well as to enjoy during their numbered years of life, is important in understanding what the human being that is me or you has to be or do. Whether we are carrying on unfinished business, picking up the dropped stitches, or building on a foundation. And none of us is the last man on the totem pole. Or, that is, we can't say that until after Jesus has come back, because we don't know how many generations may come after us. We have something to do for the next generation too, something to pass on, something to start which they can go on with, something to prepare that they may complete. Ah, you say, that lets me out because I am not going to have a child. But that really isn't an excuse. Just look at the importance of single aunts and single uncles in the line or on the family tree or in the tapestry. We do not stand alone, touching no one. We cannot slide into the water and cause no ripple. We are human beings, even if we are not being human. Other people have made a difference to us, whether we can point it out or not. We're making a difference to other people right now. However, the people who have made the most difference to us are the ones without whose existence we would not be. If it hadn't been for a line of people, couples and their sets of chromosomes that had met, made choices, passed something on to the next generation, made more choices, started in the north of Ireland or Scotland or Wales or Manchester and ended up in America and then China, there wouldn't have been any me, that is certain. Except for God's intervention in bringing forth the unique, once in all history virgin birth of Jesus Christ, every human being has come into existence because of the meeting of 23 chromosomes with 23 other chromosomes, those sets coming from distinct human beings, one a male, one a female. God's creation of perfect human beings was spoiled when the fall took place, when Adam and Eve both became sinners and handed down a new image or put their stamp, so to speak, on the next generation. They produced with their spoiled genes, spoiled human beings, which soon became evident in Cain's behavior. We are made in the image of God, all right, but we have a long line of genes behind us, each one of us, which have given us a lot of imperfections, physically, psychologically, emotionally, and spiritually. There's no perfect human being. When scientists talk of making clones, what perfect human being would they want two of? I'm looking back over my line. I'll be tracing first a portion of my genes that came from the north of Ireland, and I'm going to come to my grandmother through the women of the family. Back in the 1700s, Lord Stirling in Scotland had a daughter named Mary Stirling. Mary Stirling married a Montgomery and named her daughter Mary. Mary Montgomery married General Monroe and named her daughter Mary. Mary Monroe married Hugh Macmillan and had a daughter she named Anne. Anne Macmillan married Hugh Boyd. Then came Rachel Boyd, who married Samuel Crooks, and they had a son, Jacob Crooks, who is my great-grandfather. The generations covered in that paragraph bring us to 1820, and we have been looking in the records which tell of County Down and St. Field in the north of Ireland, with a line back into Stirling Castle in Scotland. One wonders about the love stories connected with all these names listed so primly on lines, making a family tree, with brothers and sisters branching off into their own fresh lines of their own. What ambitions and expectations were lived through, what excitements and disappointments, what appreciation of the heather and rocks, the fields of sheep, or the patches of potatoes. What wonder did they have about the wool which could be cut, cleaned, carded, spun into yarn, and then knit into marvelous Afghans, blankets, hundreds of stockings, sweaters, mittens, and caps, while other yarn was spun to be woven on great looms into Irish tweed or Scottish tartans. Who lived in a castle and had her children in a castle? And what girl said, "I care nothing about the kind of a dwelling place. I love him, and any small cottage with him in it will be better than a palace without him"? In 1741, Handel was living in a little stone house in London. He was 56 that year, and the greatest work of his life was to be done during a 3-week period of that same year. We are told he wrote the Messiah in 23 days, while shut into one room of that little house and eating the food a servant brought him, without much thought of what it was. His head must have been full of all the music you and I hear when we shut all else out and listen to the Messiah on some good disc we have of it. The wind can be blowing a gale, the rain or snow hissing against the windows, and the music seems our music, our own praise of God, something sent straight from God to give us a vehicle rich enough to express what we feel. The difference is that Handel composed it. It is reported that he wrote in great exultation, that the inspiration which filled him as the notes poured out shook his whole being, and that after completing the second part of the oratorio with the Hallelujah chorus in it, he claimed with his face streaming with tears, "I did think I saw all heaven before me, and the great God himself a light shining in the darkness." His work has brought truth in a rich way to the ears of the world. The Messiah was first performed in Dublin, Ireland, 1742. I wonder how many people alive at that time in Ireland and Scotland and throughout Britain heard it, and how soon it reached their ears and minds and attention in the following weeks, months, and years. Had Jacob Crook's ancestors been among those who heard the early performances of Handel? We don't know, but we do know that my great-grandfather Jacob Crooks and great-grandmother Nancy McRoberts Crooks of St. Field, County Downs, North Ireland, with their 2 small children, Eliza Jane, born in 1841, 100 years after the Messiah was written, and her little brother David, sailed to America in 1844. The family set forth on a sailing vessel that required the passengers to bring their own food, which in their case consisted of a few sacks of potatoes. A long, far cry from Lord Stirling and from any semblance of a castle or a mansion. This tiny family that so bravely set off to a new land with so little material goods in New York City sold the leftover potatoes for a number of shillings, but shillings in American coins were worth only half of the English shilling. So that handful of coin meant Grandfather Jacob had been cheated, and there was no way to make it right. I wonder how they got to Pittsburgh. There were railroads, the B&O line having started in 1830, and the first locomotive express from Boston to New York had begun in 1839. It is stated that in 1835 there were 200 chartered railroad lines in the country. However, all these were short runs. Probably Jacob and Nancy and Eliza Jane and David boarded a stagecoach. It must have seemed a long way, but somehow they got settled in Pittsburgh. Their small house was very close to the Allegheny River, now the North Side area, which overflowed its banks yearly. One Saturday afternoon, the family had to come back home by boat from the preparatory service for communion the next day. I wonder what happened to the loom. Grandfather, who was a weaver, continued in that trade, and his loom was set up in the front room of their house. These two were my father's grandparents. They had 9 children, and in the records, beside the name of 5 of them, 2 were twins, is a small D, meaning that child died in early infancy or during the first year. What sorrow and heartache this immigrant mother must have had, with no telephone to ever make possible the comfort of hearing her mother's voice from Ireland. There are 2 pages of grandmother's sayings written by Cousin Marion, who well remembered them as often repeated by the whole family, sayings which revealed a sense of humor and something of her character. She spoke of a housekeeper so efficient that, quote, she made up all the beds in the house before anybody was up, end quote. When Grandfather Crooks complained about the flour barrel becoming empty so soon, she said, quote, aren't you glad you lived to see the last of it? End quote. And speaking of things printed in newspapers, whether true or not, she remarked, paper and ink never refuse anything. But we can't linger in this generation. It's 2 of the children of this family who have affected me the most. Eliza Jane, who became my father's mother, and her younger sister, Rachel, who was not only to become my father's first teacher, but whose name Rachel was to be given to me. However, before we can have Eliza Jane married, we need to bring the Sevilles to America. John Seville was born in Manchester, England, and lived there until he was 11 years old. It must have been at the turn of the century that he came to America in a sailing vessel with his parents and located in Philadelphia. We have the fact that in 1819 he moved from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh, where he followed his trade, that of a tailor, later engaging in furniture dealing. He continued to move further west, and in Ohio he embarked in the grocery business and purchased an interest in a line of canal boats. At the outbreak of the Civil War, he was one of the first to volunteer. I quote from Western Pennsylvania records. He required no government document to discharge him from the perils and dangers of war, freedom from such further duty having come to him at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where he met his death. His wife was Hannah Williams Seville, and of their 9 children, 3 sons died while fighting in the Union Army in the Civil War, and 2 daughters were deceased. What tragic news came in the lifetime of this dear Hannah, as she had to have the news of her husband's death, and one at a time the news of the deaths of her 3 sons in the war. What nursing did she do? What nights of worry and fear did she endure as she cared for 2 baby daughters who died? She was my great-grandmother. Someday I'll meet her in heaven and hear the whole story, but with the fullness that only heaven can bring. Right now, records from archives can only give stark, almost mathematical facts. Born, died, and in between, the whole reality of purpose and meaning and the handing down of a flag so that it might not be lost. Threads in the tapestry, each one important, each one a part of the pattern, yet in our limited vision with eyes that get strained and blurred at times, we have to narrow things down. John Franklin Seville was the son of Hannah and John, who did not die in the Civil War and who did not die at birth. Because he lived, I am here to tell you the story. John Franklin Seville was born in Pittsburgh, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, October 21st, 1836. I'll just quote the account in the genealogical and personal history of Western Pennsylvania to give you the flavor. He was there reared and educated, in early life learning the plumber's and gas fitter's trade, which he followed until 1868. In that year, he moved to Ross Township, where he purchased land, set out many orchards, and became a fruit grower, in which he prospered. Both he and his wife hold membership in the United Presbyterian Church, of which he was a trustee. And who is the wife? None other than little Eliza Jane Crooks, who had come over with her mother and father and the sack of potatoes on that sailing ship. It was on her 18th birthday that Eliza Jane was to be married. March 9th, 1859. She was 4 feet 10 inches tall, with long, thick brown hair and dark brown eyes, a slim bit of a North of Ireland girl with lots of spunk and a determined will. Can't you just hear someone say that she must wait until she was 18? And her arranging the wedding on her birthday to wait not one day longer? It was her mother who had all those famous sayings, one of which was, "She'll be sorry for that once, and that'll be all her life." She is said to have made that remark concerning someone who is marrying too young. However, often she said it. Eliza Jane wasn't frightened off from marrying her beloved John Franklin Saville on her 18th birthday and becoming Mrs. Saville with a 23-year-old husband. It is a breathtaking thing to hold the magnifying glass on this bit of the tapestry and follow the pattern from the vantage point of about 130 years later. We can see what they couldn't see. Eliza Jane had a younger sister, Rachel, born in America, who looked so much like her people would have thought they were twins. Also 4 feet 10 inches, also with dark brown sparkling eyes and long brown wavy hair, Rachel was to become a very good school teacher and then to marry George Peyton, who would become an official in the Union National Bank of Pittsburgh. John Saville's 10-acre fruit farm was to be next to the Peyton's property. Great Aunt Rachel started a dame's school for primary education, to which not only my father would go, but also some of his brothers and sisters, Aunt Rachel's own daughter, Marion Peyton, and later some of the grandchildren of the family, as well as outside children. In this school, Rachel must have given a fantastically good foundation, for the children she taught were later to be the highest in their classes in university, and still later, leading doctors and missionaries as well as leaders in other professions. Eliza Jane and John Saville were to have 8 children. My Aunt Edith, for whom I was named, and Aunt Bess, Jenny, and Alice, as well as my doctor, Uncle Dade, Uncle Frank, Herbert, who died in infancy, and my father, George Hugh Saville, born 1876 to live until 1977, dying when he was 101 years and 3 days old. Before going on to my father, let me say that Aunt Rachel and Uncle George Peyton's threads, as well as Cousin Marion's, can be followed right up into L'Abri and Humeaus, Switzerland. Aunt Rachel gave her own daughter a good foundation in her dame school, and as language was one of her best subjects, it is not surprising that she went on to be extremely good in Arabic, speaking as well as reading the language. Cousin Marion went to Egypt under the United Presbyterian Board and continued in girls' school teaching for 40 years. Her father felt that she was his gift to the Lord. "I'm sending my daughter to Egypt as my gift to God's work, and therefore I want to support her and her work completely as far as financial expense goes, as well as to pray for her." His only other child had died, and he was able to care for Marion's needs all through his life and to leave her enough to go on with through her life. When Cousin Marion retired from the work in Egypt, she came to live with my mother and father for a time. By that time, the family letters for L'Abri were being sent out once every 2 months, and with my mother, she helped fold them, taking part as well in the Monday days of prayer and days of fasting and prayer called for any special reason for L'Abri. When Cousin Marion died, much to the surprise of the entire family, her frugal living had enabled her to leave a sum of $20,000, and it was given to L'Abri Fellowship Foundation. It came just as we were praying for the needs of Farrell House. That money not only purchased the first tape recorders for Farrell House Study, but also finished the building, that is, the Farrell House underneath the chapel, and purchased a piece of land for L'Abri as well. In those days, a dollar was worth $4.36 Swiss francs. So, as Uncle George Peyton worked faithfully away in the bank, and here beside me, still telling good time, I had the watch that was given him the year before I was born for 40 years of faithful service in the bank. He was not only working in Egypt for the Lord, but in L'Abri. Such are the patterns of the tapestry. Also, the little rocking chair you have seen in pictures at the foot of our bed in Chalet Les Mélizes, where Fran sat to dictate all his letters, to carry on conversations, and to write his first books was Aunt Rachel's rocking chair, in which she sat to teach my father. That's where we'll stop for now.
That's amazing. I love hearing all of that.
Yeah.
And I like hearing about Switzerland. Do you know the best thing about Switzerland?
Yeah, I do.
Its
Go ahead.
flag. It's a big plus.
Mm-hmm.